At my daughter-in-law's baby shower, my son-in-law handed me an envelope and said, "We need you out of this house by the end of the month. We're selling it." I looked at him, nodded once, and drove straight to my brother's place across town. The next morning, a woman in a gray suit was knocking on his front door, and it wasn't a realtor. "My name is Raymond Holt. I am 67 years old, and I want you to stay with me until the very end of this story, because what happened in the weeks that followed is something I never could have predicted, not in 30 years of expecting the worst from people. If you're someone who believes that patience is its own kind of strength, and that the truth has a way of surfacing no matter how deep someone tries to bury it, then this story is for you." I built the house on Sycamore Ridge Drive in Knoxville, Tennessee, in 1991. I was 32 years old, working nights as an electrician and weekends doing side jobs to make the mortgage. My wife, Helen, picked the color for every room. She chose a pale yellow for the kitchen because she said it made the mornings feel warmer. She was right about that, the way she was right about most things. We raised our only daughter, Melissa, in that house. We watched her ride her bicycle down that driveway for the first time. We watched her leave for college with a minivan full of bedding and too many shoes. And we watched her come back home at 26 with a man named Greg Sutton she had met at a conference and married 14 months later. Helen passed away 2.5 years ago. Ovarian cancer. She fought it longer than the doctors expected, and she did it without ever once complaining in front of me, because that was the kind of woman she was. After she was gone, the house became something different. The same rooms, the same pale yellow kitchen, but quieter in a way that had weight to it. Melissa worried about me living alone. She called every other day in those first few months, and I could hear the guilt in her voice every time she had to hang up and go back to her own life. So when she and Greg proposed moving in to help take care of me, I said yes without hesitating. I told myself it was practical. An older man alone in a big house, a young couple who could use the space. I gave them the master bedroom because my knees had been giving me trouble with the stairs anyway. I moved myself into the downstairs guest room, where I had everything I needed and a view of the backyard garden Helen had planted the summer before she got sick. I want to be honest with you about Greg Sutton, because it matters to the story. He was not a cruel man in obvious ways. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make direct threats. He was the kind of person who would smile and offer to refill your coffee while simultaneously making you feel like an inconvenience in your own home. He was an account manager at a logistics company downtown, good at his job by all accounts, and very good at presenting himself in a way that made other people feel like they were the problem. Within the first year of them moving in, Greg had turned the garage into what he called his home office, covering the shelves where I kept 30 years of tools with rolling whiteboards and ergonomic furniture. He mentioned the property taxes once over dinner in a way that wasn't quite a question and wasn't quite a statement, just a number left hanging in the air. He started referring to the house as our place in conversations with neighbors, not Melissa's, not mine, but ours, as if the deed were already a formality to be sorted out in due time. Melissa, for her part, was not unkind. She loved me, I know that. But she loved Greg too, and she was 7 months pregnant by the time any of this came to a head. And I think when you are carrying a child and building a life with someone, it becomes very hard to see clearly what that person is doing behind the scenes when you are not in the room. There was one afternoon, about 5 months before everything fell apart, when Melissa was at a prenatal appointment and Greg was supposedly working from the garage. I was in the kitchen making a sandwich when I heard him on the phone. I wasn't trying to listen. I just hadn't moved yet, and the window was open, and his voice carried. I heard him say, "Once the baby comes, the situation with Ray becomes a lot easier to manage." Then a pause. Then, because she'll be overwhelmed, that's why. It's the right time. I stood very still for a moment. Then I went back to making my sandwich and said nothing about it to anyone. That same evening, after dinner, I called my older brother, Thomas. Thomas was 71, a retired county clerk who had spent 30 years dealing with property records and legal paperwork in Anderson County. He was the kind of man who knew how things worked and who kept records of everything out of pure professional habit. I didn't tell him what I'd overheard. I just asked him, casually, what a person would need to do if they wanted to transfer a property to someone else without the owner knowing. He walked me through it. Quick claim deeds, notary requirements, county recorder filings. He explained what a fraudulent transfer would look like on paper and what would give it away. I thanked him, hung up the phone, and sat in the pale yellow kitchen for a long time thinking about nothing in particular. A week later, I pulled out a legal pad and wrote down everything I owned and where it was. The house deed, which was in my name alone and had been since Helen and I paid off the mortgage 11 years earlier. My retirement accounts, Helen's life insurance policy, which had paid out to me as the named beneficiary. And one other thing, a policy I had taken out on myself 3 years ago that named Melissa as my sole beneficiary, with a secondary clause I had added quietly 6 months earlier, after Greg's phone call, that transferred that secondary beneficiary status to Thomas in the event Melissa was legally unable or unwilling to claim it. I put the legal pad in a sealed envelope, drove it to Thomas's house on a Tuesday morning while Greg thought I was at a doctor's appointment, and I told Thomas to put it somewhere safe and not to open it unless I asked him to, or unless something happened to me. Thomas looked at me for a long moment across his kitchen table and said, "Raymond, what's going on?" I told him what I'd heard through the kitchen window. I told him about the garage, the property tax comment, the way Greg said "our place" to the neighbors. Thomas is not a man who shows alarm easily. He spent 30 years watching people try to manipulate property records. But something in his expression shifted when I finished talking, and he said, "You keep your eyes open, and you call me the minute anything moves." I drove home that afternoon and resumed being a quiet, cooperative old man with bad knees and no apparent suspicions whatsoever. The baby shower was Melissa's idea, held in our living room on a Saturday afternoon in March. Melissa's friends, Greg's coworkers, a few neighbors, about 40 people total, with pastel balloons and a cake that said, "Baby Sutton coming soon" in green icing. I wore my good shirt and smiled at everyone and refilled the punch bowl twice. Helen would have loved every second of it, and I spent most of the afternoon thinking about that. Greg pulled me aside about an hour into the party, when Melissa was occupied with a gift-opening circle in the living room. He led me into the hallway near the laundry room, out of earshot, and handed me a white envelope. I opened it. Inside was a single printed page, a letter on what appeared to be a legal letterhead, informing me that the property at Sycamore Ridge Drive had been transferred to Greg and Melissa Sutton as joint tenants, and that the previous sole owner, Raymond Holt, had 30 days to vacate the premises. I read it twice. Greg was watching me with his arms crossed, and what I can only describe as a careful expression, like a man who has rehearsed this moment and is checking whether it's going according to plan. I folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, and put the envelope in my shirt pocket. "All right," I said. Greg blinked. I think he expected more. "You're not going to say anything?" he said. "Enjoy the rest of the party, Greg," I said, and walked back into the living room and refilled the punch bowl for the third time. I did not tell Melissa that day. She was glowing and happy and 8 months pregnant, and I decided the worst thing I could do to my daughter was ruin her baby shower with something that was about to become Greg's problem, not mine. I hugged her at the end of the night, held on a little longer than usual, and drove to Thomas's house with the envelope on the passenger seat and 30 years of quiet fury sitting somewhere behind my sternum. Thomas put on coffee. I handed him the envelope. He read it once, set it down, and went to his home office. He came back 11 minutes later with a printed sheet from the Anderson County property records he had pulled up on his computer. "There's a deed filed 4 days ago," he said. "Quick claim transfer, purportedly signed by you, transferring full ownership to Greg and Melissa Sutton as joint tenants with right of survivorship." He set the paper on the table between us. "Raymond, when did you sign a deed?" "I didn't," I said. Thomas nodded slowly, the way he always did when something confirmed what he already suspected. "Then somebody forged your signature," he said, "and had it notarized, and filed it with the county." He paused. "That's 3 separate felonies before we even get to the letter he handed you." I slept at Thomas's house that night, in his spare room, with the envelope on the nightstand and my phone charging on the floor. I did not sleep much. I thought about Helen's kitchen tiles, yellow as morning light. I thought about Melissa at 8 months pregnant, not knowing what her husband had done. I thought about the phone call I had overheard 5 months earlier. The word manage, the word overwhelmed, the precise clinical way Greg had calculated the moment when the people around me would be least equipped to protect me. And then I stopped thinking about all of that and I called a woman named Beverly Cho. Beverly was a property attorney in Knoxville who had handled Helen's estate when she passed. She was 63, sharp as anyone I had ever met, and she had a particular dislike for what she called paperwork crimes, which was her term for any fraud that used legal documents as its weapon. I had her home number because she had given it to me after Helen's death and said to call if I ever needed anything. I had not called in 2 years. I called now. I told her everything. the party, the envelope, Thomas's discovery, the timeline. Beverly listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said, "Don't go back to that house tonight. Don't contact Greg. Don't contact Melissa yet either. Let me make 2 calls first thing tomorrow morning." I asked her what she was going to do. "I'm going to find out who notarized that deed," she said. "And then I'm going to find out whether that notary is licensed, and whether they were present when the document was allegedly signed, and whether any of this holds up to 15 minutes of scrutiny." She paused. "Raymond, in my experience, people who commit this kind of fraud do it quickly and sloppily because they're counting on the victim being too shocked or too old or too grief-stricken to push back. They almost always leave something behind." I told her I wasn't any of those things. "At least not right now." "I know," she said. "That's why you called me at 10:30 on a Saturday night." Beverly called me back the following Monday morning with the kind of news that makes your hands go still on the kitchen table. The notary listed on the forged deed was a man named Carl Withers, a notary public out of Knox County whose license had actually expired 8 months earlier. He had not renewed it. He was therefore not legally authorized to notarize anything, which meant the document was invalid on its face, before you even got to the question of the forged signature. But Beverly had gone further than that. She had cross-referenced the date on the deed with a record Thomas had pulled from my phone, a photo I had taken that same day at a hardware store 15 miles away, time-stamped and geotagged. I had no memory of taking the photo specifically. I often photographed products I was thinking of buying, but that image placed me definitively on the other side of town at the exact time the deed claimed I was in front of Carl Withers, signing over my home. Beverly filed a formal complaint with the Knox County Register of Deeds Fraud Division that same afternoon. She also sent a letter to Greg Sutton's home address, which was my home address, informing him in plain legal language that the deed he had filed was fraudulent, that the matter had been referred to law enforcement, and that any attempt to list, sell, mortgage, or encumber the property at Sycamore Ridge Drive or pending investigation would constitute an additional criminal act. Thomas told me later that Greg's car was in the driveway all day Monday, which was unusual for a weekday. He did not go to work. The detective assigned to the case was a woman named Detective Sandra Pruitt, Knox County Economic Crimes Unit, 19 years on the force. Beverly met with her on Tuesday morning and walked her through the document trail. Detective Pruitt pulled Carl Withers' licensing records herself within the hour, confirmed the expiration, and had him brought in for questioning by Tuesday afternoon. Carl Withers was not a sophisticated man. He was a notary who had let his license lapse and apparently agreed to help Greg Sutton notarize a document he had no legal authority to notarize. In exchange for, according to the records that later came out, $800 paid through a payment app on Greg's phone. He cooperated with investigators almost immediately. Detective Pruitt obtained a warrant for Greg Sutton's financial records on Wednesday. What she found there made the deed fraud look like a preliminary sketch for something much larger. Greg had, over the preceding 18 months, quietly opened a home equity line of credit against my property, using what Beverly later confirmed were additional forged documents, and had drawn down $41,000 from it over the course of 6 months. He had also contacted 2 separate real estate agents in the greater Knoxville area about listing the property, with one written email exchange containing the line, "My father-in-law is being relocated. We want to move quickly on the sale." Relocated. That was the word he used. Detective Pruitt showed up at Sycamore Ridge Drive on Thursday morning at 8:15. I was not there. I was at Thomas's kitchen table drinking coffee when Beverly called to tell me it was happening. Thomas turned on the small television in his kitchen, and we sat there without speaking for a while. Not watching anything in particular, just sitting. Beverly told me later that Melissa opened the front door, not Greg. That she looked confused at first, and then the detective asked for Greg Sutton by name, and Melissa's face changed in a way Beverly's assistant, who was parked across the street watching the property, described as going very, very still. Greg was taken in for formal questioning that morning. He was charged the following week: deed fraud, forgery, unlawful use of a financial instrument, and unauthorized encumbrance of property. Carl Withers was charged separately with notary fraud and conspiracy. The home equity line of credit was immediately frozen by the lender once law enforcement notified them of the fraudulent application. The forged deed was voided by the Knox County Register of Deeds within days of the investigation being opened, and my name was restored as the sole legal owner of the property at Sycamore Ridge Drive, exactly where it had been for 31 years. I want to tell you about Melissa, because this is the part of the story I have thought about the most in the months since. She called me the evening after Greg was taken in for questioning. She was crying, and for a long time she couldn't get any words out. Just the sound of someone who had discovered that the person they trusted most had been quietly building something terrible right beside them while they were busy growing a life. I drove back to the house that evening. Melissa was sitting at the kitchen table, the pale yellow kitchen, with her hands flat on the surface and her eyes red. She was 8.5 months pregnant, and she looked like a woman who had been handed a version of her life she hadn't been prepared for. I sat down across from her, the same table where I had eaten breakfast for 30 years, and I did not tell her it would be fine, because I didn't know if it would be. I just stayed. She said, "Dad, I didn't know." I said, "I know you didn't." She said, "How did you know? How did you know to be ready?" I told her about the phone call I had overheard 5 months earlier. I told her about Thomas and the envelope and Beverly Cho. I told her that I had spent 5 months being a quiet old man with bad knees, while quietly making sure that everything Greg tried to move would land on solid ground that had already been prepared. She put her head down on her arms and cried for a while, and I got up and made her a cup of tea, 'cause that is what you do. 3 weeks later, my grandson was born. They named him William, after Melissa's grandfather on Helen's side. I was in the waiting room when he arrived, and when the nurse brought him out to me, bundled up tight and squinting against the light the way new people do, I thought about Helen, and I thought about the house, and I thought about the yellow kitchen and everything that kitchen had held over 31 years. And I understood clearly, maybe more clearly than I ever had, that some things are worth every ounce of patience it takes to protect them. Greg Sutton accepted a plea agreement 4 months later. 18 months of probation, full restitution of the $41,000 drawn from the fraudulent home equity line, 500 hours of community service, and a permanent felony record that followed him into every future conversation about employment and creditworthiness he would ever have. The real estate agents he had contacted both filed formal complaints against him with the Tennessee Real Estate Commission. His employer terminated him within 2 weeks of the charges becoming public record. He and Melissa separated shortly after William was born. That was her decision, made quietly and without drama, the way the women in our family tend to make the decisions that matter most. They moved into a small apartment about 2 miles away. Melissa and I settled into a new arrangement. Sunday dinners, Thursday afternoons with the baby, a rhythm that felt, over time, like something we had always been heading toward without knowing it. I repainted the kitchen last spring, not because it needed it, but because I wanted to. I chose the same pale yellow Helen had chosen 30 years earlier, because the color was right then and it is still right now. Thomas came over and helped me tape the trim, complaining the entire time that I was using the wrong roller, and when we were done we sat on the back porch in the afternoon sun and drank lemonade and didn't talk much. The house is quiet again, but it is a different kind of quiet now. It is the quiet of a place that belongs to itself, that has weathered what it needed to weather, and come through with all its walls intact. Some evenings I sit in my chair by the front window and watch the light change over Sycamore Ridge Drive, and I think about Helen, and I think about Melissa and William across town, and I think about the envelope I carried to Thomas's house on a Tuesday morning when everything was still uncertain, and the outcome was still something I could only work toward rather than know. My son-in-law had been counting on grief to make me careless. He had been counting on age to make me slow. He had been counting on a pregnant daughter and a house full of party guests, and the weight of a dead wife's memory to leave me without the steadiness to push back. He miscalculated every single one of those things. If this story meant something to you, if you have ever had to protect something quietly while the world expected you to fall apart, hit that like button for me and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I will see you there.